Great.
Oh, so sorry.
Don't worry. Don't worry at all. Don't worry at all.
I was prepared to speak for 8 o'clock tonight. I was going to go over my talk.
Don't worry.
In the
Everything
afternoon.
is fine. Everything's fine. Are we? I think we can start, Angela. Καλησπέρα σε όλους. Σήμερα έχουμε μια ιδιαίτερη χαρά να έχουμε σαν ομιλητή τον Reverend Dr. Michael Balboni, ο οποίος μας κάνει την τιμή να μας μιλήσει από τη Βοστόνη για ένα τόσο σημαντικό θέμα όπως είναι η θεολογική άποψη για την φροντίδα του ασθενούς. Ο Dr. Balboni έχει ένα διδακτορικό δίπλωμα από το Boston University και έχει ολοκληρώσει την μεταδιδακτορική εκπαίδευσή του στο Harvard School of Public Health και στη Θεολογική Σχολή του Πανεπιστημίου του Harvard. Είναι σήμερα Instructor της Ψυχιατρικής στην Ιατρική Σχολή του Harvard και διδάσκει στο νοσοκομείο Brigham and Women's του Πανεπιστημίου του Harvard. Έχει βραβευθεί από το Πανεπιστήμιο του Σικάγου για το πρόγραμμα Θρησκεία και Ιατρική του Πανεπιστημίου. Ως θεολόγος έχει εστιάσει στην ανάπτυξη της θεολογίας της ιατρικής και επικεντρωθεί στα θεολογικά υποστρώματα που έχουν σχέση με την πνευματική φροντίδα σε ένα πλουραλιστικό, κοσμικό, ιατρικό περιεχόμενο. Ο Dr. Balboni στην ακαδημαϊκή του έρευνα ασχολείται με προγράμματα που μελετούν την πνευματικότητα και την θρησκεία στα τελικά στάδια της ζωής και την ιατρική. Μαζί με την σύζυγό του, καθηγήτρια της ιατρικής στο Harvard, Tracy Balboni, που θα έχουμε τη χαρά και την τιμή να ακούσουμε σε μια μελλοντική παρουσίαση στη δική μας διαδικτυακή σειρά μαθημάτων, είναι συγγραφέας του βιβλίου «Από την επιθετικότητα στη φιλοξενία, πνευματικότητα και επαγγελματική κοινωνικοποίηση μέσα στην ιατρική», όπως και το βιβλίο «Πνευματικότητα και θρησκεία μέσω στην κουλτούρα της ιατρικής, από την ένδειξη στην πράξη». Τέλος να πω ότι ο Dr. Balboni είναι χειροτονημένος ιερέας, είναι πάστορας της εκκλησίας στην Park Street στη Βοστόνη. Σήμερα θα μας μιλήσει με θέμα Theological Issue on Caring for the Sick. Thank you again, Dr. Balboni, for the privilege and honor to have you today as our invited speaker. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Linos. It's a privilege and honor to be with you all. I wish I could see who's listening, but I'll trust that you're there. I had a unfortunate mishap in which I thought I was presenting 12 hours from now at 8 o'clock tonight, and I just saw an email 10 minutes ago saying, "We're eagerly waiting for you to come on," and I was like, oh no. But the Apostle Paul, he says in his writings to Timothy that we are to be ready to speak in season and out of season. So here I am out of season as I was going to work on prepare my talk this afternoon and preparing for tonight, but here I am, so I got to be ready. In light of that, I'm going to share my screen and take you into a presentation and that I was planning on giving you, but I haven't had even a chance to review it, but nevertheless, here we go. This is thinking about end-of-life care and a theology of thinking about end-of-life care. And I am both a pastor and a theologian. And I am also a practical theologian focusing on the intersection of the social sciences and theology, in which we are looking at how people are living and thinking in today and bringing it into engagement with theology in order to propose practical solutions on how to faithfully live out the Christian theology in today's world. And titled this specific talk from Psalm 90, Teach Us to Number Our Days. And I want to propose to you 6 questions around pastoral care for the seriously ill and those who are dying. And just take you right through 6 questions, beginning with this one. And this is at least within the American context. And for other contexts in different cultures, there might be a different dynamics. So I apologize if my focus is on particularly Western and especially American ways of thinking. Perhaps in your culture, there will be a different way of approach, and I'd be curious and would like to learn more about that. But in the United States, and I think in Europe, why is talking about dying so difficult? It's a issue that's often avoided, and it hasn't always been so. According to one historian who described death as a tame death, in which death in pre-19th century Europe and the United States, death was familiar. It was something that was understood, and it was part of the community and part of living. Death was close to home, and caring for those who were sick and dying took place within the home. And the burial of people would be in a local graveyard, and many people would visit the dead frequently because it would be close to home. These were some of the shared social practices, and death was tame. It was known. It was understood. It was accepted, and it was not hidden. But beginning in about the 20th century, what French historian Philippe Ariz calls a forbidden death, there was a transition from a tame death to death becoming forbidden, in which there was in our culture a total suppression of everything that was reminding us of death. And there are various reasons for it. There's epidemiological reasons. There's issues around security. Death became somewhat of the new taboo. Ariz says in the old puritanical world, the taboo was sex. Now in the secular world, the new taboo is talking about death. And it's represented in one study where 86% of lung disease patients who were seriously ill and had a high likelihood of coming to end of life, 86% of lung disease patients did not want to talk about end of life, but preferred to rather concentrate on staying alive than to talk about death. Though talking about death and preparing for it was highly relevant, people put their head in the sand and they don't want to face it. And I would also suggest to you that at least in America, perhaps this isn't true in other places, but perhaps it is, that the church, if I can speak from specifically from a Christian perspective, the church has often been complicit to the willingness to avoid and not talk about death. There is a comfort in talking about a health and wealth gospel. There has been a tendency with many church plants to lose the intergenerational nature of churches, in which we have young people clustered together, old people clustered together, but not a real mixing as clearly as the intent, God's intent for the church. And that has tended to having lots of young people and to avoid talking about or even needing to think about death. And when you have a message that you want to try to win people and get them to come to your church and give to your church, you don't want to have downer subjects like talking about death. You want to have upbeat, exciting, hopeful messages, and that's why I'm suggesting that that the church can often be complicit in not talking about death. So that first question, why is talking about dying so difficult? It's because some of these cultural issues that have been going on, in which death has become foreign to us, especially for epidemiological reasons, and it's become this taboo topic that people want to avoid. And we want to focus on what's good and what's healthy, and we don't want to think about downer subjects. And the church itself, which should have a prophetic way of dealing with this topic, has lost its prophetic perspective. So let me move to a second question. How do I promote a church culture that's better prepared for dying and death? So let's, this is based on surveys of qualitative interviews of clergy that I performed in 2015 with individual one-on-one interviews with clergy, as well as focus groups coming from a variety of both urban and suburban contexts, both in the Northeast and the Midwest, as well as in California and in Texas, in order to get a kind of a range of perspectives within the United States. This is where I conducted some of these interviews in trying to get at this question of being a church or a religious congregation that is better prepared for death and dying. And some of the things that we were discovering with clergy is, were clergy prepared for their own dying? And this is something in which we did discover that a number, at least over a third of clergy had not had a will, did not have the legal documents of preparing for their own dying. And so it became very clear that if you're not thinking yourself about death and dying, you can't shepherd others in death and dying. The importance of having a legal will, a healthcare proxy, establishing clarity about what your wishes are as you engage end-of-life care, the potential of end-of-life care. And then there are we found that there are a number of ways of facilitating community discussions. There's the Conversation Project, there's the 5 Wishes program, and some of these have been tailored for religious community use, using the framework in order to help people become comfortable with thinking about death and dying. And for those who are in ministry, really preaching and teaching publicly to the entire congregation at least a few times a year on topics around suffering, illness, death is extremely important. That the congregations hear about these things and hear stories of how people have dealt with suffering as well as dealt with end-of-life care. These are kind of critical components of a congregation that is helping people, shepherding people to be prepared for their own dying. Because if we're not talking about it, if we're only talking about the good things, the happy things, and we're not preparing people for the hard things, then we're not pastoring well. Helping the congregation learn about hospice and palliative care. There's been a historic palliative care, if you know the history, has been entwined with the Christian religion, but there's also been in more recent times kind of almost a hostility towards hospice and palliative care, misunderstandings, thinking that that those who are in hospice are trying to get you dead, which is not at all the case. Certainly not in the United States. So cultivating understanding within the congregation, what is hospice? What is palliative care? Empowering your doctors and nurses within your own congregation to come alongside those who are sick and dying, because doctors and nurses who especially who are in your congregation are fluent in 2 languages. They're fluent in the language of medicine and science, and they understand the implications of having certain illnesses. And they are also, God willing, they're fluent in one's faith perspective. And having the fluency between these 2 languages, the doctors and nurses who are in your congregation, they have the ability to bring these worlds together in a very faithful, consistent, and coherent way. And so calling upon and empowering doctors and nurses within your congregation to do this is very important. And I think this also then leads to health ministries, parish nursing, having visitation to those who are sick and shut in, and those who are facing serious illness and chronic end of life issues. This is very, very important. So when we get to this question of how do I promote a church culture better prepared for dying and death, when we interviewed clergy, the clergy kind of named these are the specific ways in which we prepare. Clergy can help shepherd and prepare a congregation to help people, help the congregation become more ready and able to number its days. So let me then move to a third question. What is the pastor's unique role to those facing illness and dying? Pastors have been given a very specific role within the community, within the religious community and congregation. And so what does that look like? How do pastors engage those specifically who are sick and dying? And in our interviews with clergy, we interviewed Protestant clergy, Roman Catholic priests, as well as Orthodox clergy. We had a few non-Christian religious spiritual leaders, like a few imams. And as we looked and engaged their responses, and we've published on these things, this is just, I could give you more details if you have those questions, and I can point you to the papers that really fill this out. But this was one key diagram that came out of a model of what it means for a theology, a kind of a pastoral theology of caring. And in the middle is the patient's own spiritual struggles, which requires the pastor to come along, the clergy or the spiritual leader, or a lay person within the congregation who's representing the congregation, to really know and engage the patient's spiritual struggles. Because for most people, not all, but for most, as they engage, as they become ill, and as their bodies begin to fail them, they have spiritual struggles. Their relationship with God becomes in question. Their purpose and vision becomes unclear, unmuddy. Unreconciled relationships become more apparent. And there are a number of other kind of spiritual struggles that most patients end up engaging. So knowing those and listening, which requires you to ask questions and to know what questions to ask in order to draw out what's going on just under the surface of experiencing serious illness. That's the essential part of shepherding. And what we heard was that clergy really have three roles to bring into as they engage the patient. One is around just being who you are. You are given an office, and as an office, you are a representative of God. And so there's this sense of just a sense of presence, in which when you go and appear, you really don't have to say much. You just have to be there. And then by being there, it brings a certain level of comfort, a certain level of engagement. By just listening, you are able to hear the patient, and it in itself, just purely in presence and in listening, there's a spiritual power. And I would also suggest that in this being, it's especially liberal Protestant clergy and liberal Catholic clergy who tend to emphasize this. Then there's believing, and it's more. It tends to be more Protestant evangelicals who emphasize this, that there are certain key beliefs that are that are quite important in order to emphasize in engaging patients. The finitude of life, of being prepared to face God, and being well prepared to have faith, and to engage that faith, to elicit faith within the patient, to give and to encourage hope within the patient through beliefs, by encouraging relationship with God, and asking key belief questions that help encourage the person and change the disposition so that they're able to stand under the pressure of being sick. And then finally, there's doing. And we found that it tends to be more pastors and priests from liturgical traditions that emphasize what clergy do. They bring prayers, which can bring great comfort. They bring the sacraments, which can bring great comfort to those who are sick. And what we found in this conceptual model, if you look at it, is that all three are critical. Your presence, beliefs, and tailoring beliefs and engagement of the patient, as well as bringing the liturgical and sacramental dimensions of the church and of Christ to the patient. And in the conceptual model, these are the if you were going to go visit someone who is sick, these are the three components that you bring. And it's when these three things are brought together, they're very powerful and bring great comfort and cut through misunderstanding and lies and struggle and suffering and bring hope. And so as pastors and others enter into the shepherding way, by drawing these three together, it touches the very core of someone who is suffering, and it is transformative for their good. I've seen this over and over and over again with people that I've cared for. So that question, what is the pastor's unique role to those facing illness and dying? It's this being and believing and doing. And we have a whole paper that's been published on this. I'd be glad to share it with you. Fourth question, and 4 of 6, should I encourage curative treatment or comfort care? And this is a question for the church. It's a question that pastors have to specifically think through. And this is especially within a context of late modern medicine that can bring, especially in the American context, that tends to bring treatment unless a person says no. They are given absolutely everything, and it can lead to very difficult putting the patient and their families in very difficult places, especially if the patient is actually dying. So let's go into this question. What are the factors in end-of-life medical decision-making that many patients, especially patients who are facing end-of-life care from a religious perspective, what are the factors that they are facing? And we developed this model. We developed this model in talking with clergy and asking this very question: how do they think about curative care versus comfort care? And there are really some key factors. The first is free will, and within free will, most clergy said it's the patient. We can't, as pastors and as community, we can't tell a patient whether they should pursue curative therapy or go after comfort, quality of life care. There is the patient and their family and decision-making proxies have been given free will, and we honor that free will. We will not come in and superimpose a specific decision that they must go one way or the other. That's not our role to tell them what to do in that way. There's free will, there's dignity within free will, and we want to honor and protect that free will. But even so, within that, there are these different factors. On the left, there's the patient's age. We would say that a patient who is much younger versus much older, if the patient is younger, there's more likelihood, and it's good decision-making if they pursue curative therapy as one of several factors. Does the sick patient have dependence? So if it is a 45-year-old mother with 3 young children, and she has a incurable cancer, should she choose comfort care and quality of life, or should she choose to go do everything she can to receive curative therapy? And, you know, in that sort of case, the 45-year-old versus the 85-year-old, the decision will likely be very different. And so if you have dependence and age are key factors. And then the final one on the left is family readiness. Is the family actually ready to receive and accept that you're dying, that the patient is dying or is going to die? And so making sure that the family is ready no matter what comes is a critical factor. If the family's not ready, and if there are unreconciled relationships, then it would be likely proper and correct for a pastor to say, let's get these family relationships set before you go down this path of allowing for comfort and palliative care. And then there are the medical components on the right side of the diagram. There's what is the prognosis, and what is the likelihood of cure or of being able to length of time that one can live, as well as what is the treatment burden. So if you receive this line of chemotherapy, to what degree will it affect your life and your ability to live each day with some sense of quality of life? So this is the general diagram in which we found that clergy were thinking. Free will is the critical key, but there are these other factors that play into things. And so here we have critical kind of questions that a pastor should be thinking about as they're engaging a patient and their families. Is the patient at peace with God? Do they have fears that have not been dealt with? Do they have a living hope, knowing that even if when they die, that they will go into the presence of Christ? Are all their relationships reconciled? Is there some purpose that they have been given by God that's yet unfulfilled? And if unfulfilled, then should they continue to do everything they can to stay alive so that they can fulfill that purpose? But on the other hand, there's this fuzzy, I'll call it a fuzzy theology, in which, at least in the United States, and it's not clear to what degree it's going on in other cultures, there has been a sense in which most patients tend to go after curative therapy. That is the default position, and it tends to be religion and being religiosity and having a theology in which you a more orthodox, lowercase o, orthodox theology. People of that viewpoint tend to go after curative therapy rather than palliative care, which is a surprising finding, because you would think that if someone is at peace with God and that they would be ready to accept their dying. But that's not actually the case, and I'm going to get into that in a moment. But I think this has been an important this model that I'm showing you here is an important lays out most of the dynamics of thinking about from a Christian religious theological perspective of how most clergy in the United States are thinking about this question. All right, next, the fifth question. And this gets into my last comment about what patients tend to do. Do clergy affect medical decisions of their congregants in serious illness? Do clergy and what in their presence and what they're doing, are they affecting medical decisions? And this is now based on there had been some previous data in which there were prospective associations of religion and aggressive medical interventions at the end of life. Andrea Enzinger, in a 2009 JAMA paper, found that higher religious coping was prospectively associated with patients actually not only preferring more aggressive medical interventions, but actually receiving more aggressive medical interventions, including going into the ICU. They were more likely to go into the ICU if high religious copers were more likely to go into the ICU than low religious copers, which was a surprising finding when that was reported. And then in 2013, we reported this Tracy Balboni, my wife, my much better half, I should say, and I and others reported, and we found that patients, even accounting for religious coping, patients who were well supported by their religious communities, well supported spiritually by their religious communities, were less likely to go into hospice care in the final week of life. They were 2.5 times more likely to receive aggressive care. They were nearly 6 times more likely of dying in the ICU. Versus, this is the contrast is high spiritual support from religious communities versus low spiritual support from religious communities. And so the comparison here in this study was that patients with high spiritual support were receiving less hospice and more aggressive care compared to those with lower spiritual support. And of course, that was both of these findings are very puzzling. What's going on? Why is religion and religious support, at least within the Christian context, associated with patients receiving more aggressive care in the end of life? Because we should expect the opposite, that those who are dying would be more accepting of their death in light of being at peace with God and having good spiritual support. So what's going on? Well, one of the studies, and to try to piece this out, we looked at clergy and we asked, what are clergy doing in the United States? And in this study that was done in 2015, we reported, based on a national representative sample of clergy. Most clergy are Christian. I'll take you through this, but we did a national representative sample of clergy in the United States. We had a strong response rate. So I'm fairly confident that the responses that I'm showing you is actually how clergy in the United States, what they believe and what they do. Again, we've published on this, and you can see the papers in far greater detail. Within the United States, among a representative sample, 83% of clergy in the United States are Protestant, 9% are Roman Catholic, 2% are Eastern Orthodox, and then among identity, 44% of clergy report to be evangelical, 34% mainline liberal, 12% Pentecostal, 9% non-apply. And we need to understand that we are looking at the Christian clergy as a group, which is different from the national US population. So the two are not represented, they're different groups. So, right now, I think just under 70% of the US population is Protestant. And 20% of the US population is Catholic. And you can see that there are differences. There are differences here. All right. So we asked them a number of questions, and this is what we posed as questions to clergy. Hear this out, and trying to get at why are people who are well supported by their religious communities, why are they getting more aggressive care? So we said to clergy, imagine visiting a congregational member with a cancer, and doctors said that the patient was extremely likely to die in the next 6 months, regardless of medical care provided. Consider the following statements a patient might make. To what extent do you agree with these statements made by the patient? The patient says to you as a pastor, my belief in God relieves me of needing to think about future medical decisions, such as a do not resuscitate order or the use of breathing machines. And here's how clergy responded. 71% of clergy said, no, I don't agree with this statement that the patient says to me at all. 20% said a little or somewhat. 9% said quite a bit or completely. So this question is getting at preparation of the future around future medical decisions. Let's look at the next question. 29% of clergy in the US, at least a little, agree with this statement. Okay. The patient says to the pastor, I believe that God will cure me of this cancer. It's a strong statement if you think about it. 14% said not at all. 54% said a little or somewhat. 32% said quite a bit or completely. When we posed this question, with the original question or statement that we posed to clergy was, I believe that God may cure me of this cancer. We had basically 100% of clergy say, I totally agree with that. So we had to change this, and we had the patient saying, God's going to do this. Yeah, he's going to cure me. There's very certainty or confidence. And still, we had 86% of clergy are agreeing with that. And that's a puzzling theological statement to agree with. The patient says, I accept every medical treatment because my faith says to do everything I can to stay alive. This is the sense of the importance of the sanctity of life. That's what this statement is trying to get at. And here we had 54% of clergy agreeing with this statement, at least a little or to somewhat, to quite a bit to completely. Or the patient says, I must faithfully endure painful medical procedures because suffering is part of God's way of testing me. And this question gets at what we might call redemptive suffering. And here we had 27% of clergy at least agreeing to some extent. So let's look at kind of what we find here. When we looked at the first question about God's will, his sovereignty over a situation, especially over future medical decisions, 29% of the clergy agreed with that statement. Now, I didn't take you through this, but we also have patient data of a representative sample of patients in the United States. And 60%, not just 60% of patients agreed with that statement. So you can say patients are even more likely than clergy to agree. Around miracles, that God will cure me of this cancer, 77% of patients agreed with this statement, that they would say that. 86, not just patients, these are patients who were had incurable cancers. 86% of clergy agreed with it. Around the sacredness of life, that I do everything I can because of the sanctity of life, 54% of clergy versus 69%. And then around redemptive suffering, I get everything I can because this is God's way of testing me, almost nearly the same. The big takeaway from this is not so much the differences between clergy and patients. The big takeaway is that there is a lot of patients and clergy in the United States who are agreeing with these theological statements, and that these statements have direct impact on medical decisions at the end of life. In fact, among clergy, we were trying to look at the different predictors of which clergy are more likely to agree with these statements. If you were Pentecostal, you were 6 times higher odds of saying this versus mainline liberal clergy, evangelical clergy, Black clergy, and those of lower income, all were statistically significant in being more likely to agree with these statements versus mainline clergy, just to kind of give you a sense of comparison. So what's going on here? Here's a little conceptual model in which these religious values, I just took you through those questions, these religious values are associated with having less understanding or knowledge of hospice, palliative care, what it means to be in the intensive care unit, I don't have time to take you through all these different questions, but there's something about having these religious values or this religious theology that leads you to have less knowledge, and that accounts for issues of social and economic status. So over and above all of those things, the adjusted odds ratios suggest a relationship with knowledge. It also, these religious values, in our study, we found that that clergy in their conversations with actual congregants, the last congregant that they had visited, we asked them about, regarding end-of-life discussions, they were half as likely to talk with their patient about hospice. So when you had these high religious values, you were much less likely to even mention hospice. And these are all the different confounders that were adjusting this model of showing the relationship. And that if the clergy person did not have an end-of-life discussion, the patient was half as likely to go into hospice, and they were more likely to go into the intensive care unit in the end of life. So back to the question, what effect, let's see if I look, do clergy affect medical decisions of congregants in serious illness? The answer is yes. They are having an effect, and the effect is not overwhelmingly powerful, but the clergy play a key role in that they're silent in engaging their patients, and it is affecting the patients because the patient is then, based on their own religious beliefs, they're less likely to go in the hospice and go into the intensive care unit. All right, so final question, and then we'll try to open this up. How might pastors navigate life-prolonging religious values? And now this is a little bit, I'm shifting now to a little bit more of a theological way of thinking here. There's a tension, and I'll offer it as a balance that is necessary within Christian theology of upholding these different ideas. So around God's sovereignty, that he is in control and that he's the one who numbers our days. There is both a essential need to submit to God's control. He's in control, not me. So I submit to him. That's one side of the belief, but on the other is the importance of human stewardship, which we have been given wisdom. We have to foresee the future and what is coming and make decisions now in light of what we foresee that's coming, faithful decisions. And it's these two things that are upheld, God's sovereignty and human responsibility. And that if we don't keep this in a necessary balance, we end up going in the wrong direction, one way or the other. And right now, within what we're measuring is that submission to God's control. I guess I'll do it this way. Submission to God's control is what's really weighing people, and it's the human stewardship that needs to get emphasized by pastors and by clergy. Or go down to healing. On the one side is expecting a miracle, and then the other is trusting the will of God, because I believe it's very clear in Scripture and in experience that God doesn't heal everyone. At least he does not miraculously heal the physical body in the here and now, although Christians believe in resurrection, that healing, ultimate healing, is coming. And so to expect a miracle it has to be brought into the proper balance of trusting the will of God, that it may not be the will of God to heal this particular person of this particular disease, and it may be actually God's will that they are going to die, because we need to know that our days are numbered, and every one of us is going to almost every one of us is likely to face these kinds of decisions. Same thing with life sacredness. Life is a gift; it must be protected, and yet life is finite, and we must recognize when we are dying. It's a critical skill of wisdom, and it's the same thing with suffering. Suffering has a redemptive value. It changes and transforms the inner soul for the better, amazingly. And yet we're not called to suffer we're not called to suffer like Christ. Christ has suffered for his people. Christ's suffering is sufficient. And so it's not as if you must allow yourself to be punished and, for example, avoid medicines, or to take, or to allow the disease to create unbelievable pain and not palliate the pain. So again, these things are to be held in balance. Well, I was going to these slides just really take you through what I just said in summary, and I know I'm kind of going on in time. Many funders help support some of the studies that I've referenced, including the John Templeton Foundation, the National Cancer Institute, and the Issachar Fund. I've worked with some amazing colleagues, Tyler Vanderweel, who's a very close, dear friend here at Harvard, as well as my dearest spouse, Tracy Balboni, who is brilliant and really just been an amazing partner in these things. So I'll end here, and I'll pass it back to our teacher.
Thank you, Dr. Balboni, for this really fascinating presentation that added more questions to the already existing, especially regarding death, a topic that is difficult for both physicians and, as I see, theologians. I do have a couple of questions. One comes from physicians and says, we physicians condemn medicalization of death, and yet in your study, theologians support this end of life. How are we going to convert theologians into the truth of dying at home, surrounded by family, and not in the hospital intensive care units?
Well, I'm convinced of that. I hope that's clear. I believe that's exactly what is necessary and needed. And I guess that does come back to the culture. The first question I try to engage is, why is talking about death and dying so difficult? And my suggestion is the religious community has to take this on. The pastor, if you are a physician or a nurse or a medical professional in your congregation, you must call your pastor and the people to think about these issues. That physician, wherever you are, it's your, I'll commission you. It's your responsibility, because of your understanding of the medicalization and the dangers of the medicalization of dying, is you've got to inform your pastor. I only know about it because of my wife. She's taught me, and I've watched her training. I've come to understand her very specific experiences around dying patients. And it's been my kind of engagement with her that I've come to understand, oh, now I understand. Now I understand. So the medical professionals who are on the front lines of caring for the sick, I said there's 2 languages, you're fluent in 2 languages, and it's your job to bring these things together, because the pastors do not understand. They don't understand, not because they don't want to, but because they're not in that world. They don't speak that language, and they're not directly engaging these things, and they don't understand the medical technologies. So the Christian doctors and nurses have to teach the pastors how to think. And that's been some of what my wife and I have been trying to do together, because we share life together. And so we see that these 2 worlds are totally meant to be united. And we need people to bring those things together in their conversations. And so I would call upon doctors and nurses and to really work with their pastors and help them to come to understand, because pastors are many of them don't know. They know the language of the gospel, and these are good, but they don't understand that other world, and they don't want to touch it because they don't want to make a mistake. So this is where we need the bringing together of the many gifts that God has given to all of his people. And it can't just fall on one.
The other question reads as follows. The value of death was the title of a recent publications of Lancet, more precisely, report of the Lancet Commission on the value of death, bringing death back into life. What is the value of death for you? Would you see apparently a value on dying?
Okay. Yeah, couple thoughts. I haven't read that article. So I haven't seen it. So I can't specifically respond to that. First, I would want to say is that death is a fundamental evil, according to Christian theology. It is the penetration of the fall and of evil, and it goes against the will of God. God does not will or desire sin, evil, or death. It is the last enemy, the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, that God intends to destroy and to undo. So our disposition towards death is we can never consider it in any way a good. And yet, God can draw the good out of the evil. He has the power to do that. That's in his sovereignty and his beauty and his majesty, his wisdom. He knows how to do that. And so that's why he's permitted death to enter into this world, because he knew he could outsmart even death and make even a greater good out of this terrible evil. And so some of the goods that we see are people are transformed spiritually as they encounter their own finitude and their own dying. And I've seen story after story of people who have been blinded spiritually, and then they've been confronted by their dying, and they've changed in a most amazing way, wonderfully towards God and towards other people. So it's not a good in itself, but God is somehow able, the Holy Spirit can draw the good out of the evil. And in that sense, I would say it brings about a kind of good. And I would also just say that, death is not the end. It is a portal to the next. It is the portal to the next season of our living. And for those that are in Christ, the promise, the hope is that our life is only going to increase. And so I'm not afraid of death. You should not. We should. Those who have hope in Christ do not need to be afraid of death, because it is an enemy, but it is also a portal in which, the scriptures say that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And that is the hope, that is the Christian hope. And that there ultimately will be resurrection of the body.
And then another also theological questions is there as follows. Are there any differences between the Eastern Orthodox theology and the other Christian theologies regarding the death, such an emphasis on the cross of Christ as opposed to the resurrection?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I've been influenced by Orthodox theologians, so I'm not a good person to answer that question. I don't know of a difference, but there may very well be, or different sorts of emphases. But I haven't seen in the empirical data, I haven't seen enough to actually tell you, because we don't have large enough samples among those who would identify as Eastern Orthodox. So that part I'm not sure about.
Dr. Balboni, your presentation really stimulated lots of thoughts to all participants and triggered kind of new challenges, the way we approach both for ourselves and for our students and for our congregations, the main issue of our life, which is death. And we are really grateful to you. And we look forward to read more of your books and your presentations in the future. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you.
You're very welcome, and thank you. It's an honor. It's an honor.
The honor is ours. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay.